Welcome to the lecture on neuroanatomy, part 2. In this lecture, we're going to be focusing on functions of different parts of the brain. Last week we took a more um, sort of narrow view towards the specific individual functions of neurons and how neurons work, but now we're going to be talking about, on a larger scale, what are the different parts of the brain and what do they do. So let's get started. So first off, we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located in the bottom of the brain next to this thing called the brain stem. You can see this 3D image here, and it's mostly responsible for muscle coordination and balance. This part of the brain actually integrates a lot of information from many other parts of the brain that we're going to discuss, and it takes in information about position of joints, things that you're hearing and things that you're seeing, and also it takes into account the commands that the sort of decision-making processes of your brain are giving to the muscles, and it integrates them all together and then outputs motor function that then cause your muscles to move. This part of the brain is responsible for hand-eye coordination, and if there's damage to this part of the brain, it's very hard to even like move your hands properly. Your motions become very erratic and you lose a lot of the ability to move properly. This part of the brain also is responsible for what we call muscle memory, the ability to, after practice, something becomes second nature where you don't have to think about it. And this is specifically like physical tasks, not mental tasks. The next part of the brain that we're going to be talking about is the cerebrum. This is the main part of the brain that you normally think about. It's this area right here that I'm dragging my mouse over. And so this is actually the largest part of the human brain. And actually, in humans, the cerebrum is larger compared to the brains of other animals um, of similar size. And so the cerebrum is actually responsible for much of the behavior that we call intelligent, like language, cognition, memory, consciousness, ability to do mathematics, creativity. All that stuff is mostly in part due to the cerebrum. So in the next few slides of the presentation, we're going to be focusing on several different lobes of the cerebrum. So we have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And so we're going to be talking about those four lobes, what their functions are. But keep in mind that the way that scientists have sort of designated these lobes is somewhat arbitrary. Even though it looks very smooth here, sort of defined, there isn't actually any sort of like physical barriers between any of these lobes. It's just scientists have basically assigned these names according to what they've observed, um, like what activities cause each of these areas of the brain to become activated. That's how they name it. There's no structural sort of designation of these four lobes. But let's get started about talking about each of these lobes. Actually, before that, first we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is basically the outermost part of the cerebrum. It's the first 2 millimeters of that, and so it comes from the word cortex, which is actually like a pretty popular term in biology. You'll hear like lots of cortices in many parts of your body, but cortex just means bark in Latin, and basically the cortex has throughout like all parts of the cortex, regardless of which lobe you're in, has 6 layers, and these correspond to like different levels of hierarchy of processing. We won't get into that now, but we might get into it later. It's about the size of a dinner napkin, and as I mentioned before, it is relatively larger in humans compared to like the proportional size of this area of the brain in other animals. So it is responsible for a large part of our intelligent behavior. And another interesting thing to note is that the structure of the cerebral cortex is similar throughout the brain, regardless of what function it's performing. So regardless of which lobe you're talking about, the overall structure like a high level structure is very similar. So that's kind of interesting. A lot of the same sort of structure can perform many different kinds of tasks. That's something to note. So now we talk about the lobes. So we're first going to be talking about the frontal lobe. As the name suggests, it's in the front of the brain right here. And it is basically the control center of the brain. It's responsible for basically executive function and basically taking actions, any sort of action that you can think about. Speech control, motor control, emotional expression, all of these things are done by the frontal lobe. It is basically the decision-making body of your brain. Um, it also contains something called Broca's area, which we're going to be talking about later. But basically, it's the decision-making process. It's also responsible for your personality, how you express your emotions, what decisions you make, and kind of something that you may have seen before is or heard of before is Phineas Gage and his accident. Basically, if you don't know, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who lived a while back, and basically a pipe went through his skull and ended up taking out a large part of his prefrontal cortex. And so fortunately, somehow he was able to survive this incident. He didn't get any infection or anything, which actually was highly probable to happen because he lived like I think about several centuries ago or almost 2 centuries ago. So but something to note was that after this incident, even though he was able to live okay, his personality changed. He started taking more risks. He started acting erratically. And so that kind of shows what a failure of the prefrontal cortex can do. This is a very essential part of the brain that is responsible for um, a lot of decision making processes. The next part of the brain that we're going to be talking about is the parietal lobe. Its purpose is to integrate sensory information from several of the other lobes, and it's also used for processing signals for the sense of touch, taste, and temperature. It includes something called the somatosensory cortex, which we'll be discussing in depth later. The temporal lobe is this area of the brain towards the bottom. It's responsible for a lot of auditory processing. It contains something called Wernicke's area, which we're also going to be talking about in the future. But it's not just auditory processing. As I mentioned before, the sort of lines between these lobes aren't super designated. Like it's not like this lobe only does this and this lobe only does that. And there's some gray area here, and so you can see that here. This area also perform some visual processing that helps out the next lobe that we're going to be talking about. And it also works with the hippocampus, which is another structure of the brain, to form visual memories. Your ability to sort of close your eyes and think about a certain incident and see everything. This lobe is responsible for that. And sort of an interesting thing about the naming, a lot of the other lobes are named after bones that they are close to. This one is a bit different. It's actually named because this area of your head is actually where balding starts. And so, balding signifies a passage of time. And so that's why it's called a temporal lobe. Next, the last lobe that we're going to be talking about is the occipital lobe. This is mainly responsible for a lot of visual processing that goes on. And so what actually happens is this receives impulses from the retina, which is at the back of your eye. The retina converts, light into nerve impulses, and these nerve impulses get sent to the opposite side of your brain, to the back, to the occipital lobe, which then does a lot of visual processing. So it's responsible for basically converting those signals into sort of visual representation of that, and it also is responsible for creating your sense of place. The brain, you're able to situate yourself. You know where you are in the world that you're in. Like that maybe you're sitting at a table. You know that there's a table. You know that you're sitting on a chair, and the ability to generate this sort of mental map, even without looking, is also done by this part of the brain. So now we're going to be talking about the language centers of the brain. You may have remembered, we talked about these earlier. The first part that we're going to be talking about is Broca's area. Broca's area is over here, near the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for a lot of speech output. So, as I mentioned before, the frontal cortex is responsible for a lot of like action making, like taking actions, right? It's like the control center, and so Broca's area is responsible for speech output, like talking. And so you can see here, this is um, basically the colored areas are representative of high activity in the brain in that area, and so when you're speaking, you can see the similar part of the brain here, Broca's area, is activated, um, and so that's if your Broca's area is damaged, you have a hard time talking. Your speech comes out kind of distorted and slurred. Um, Next, Wernicke's area is over here near the temporal lobe, and it's used for actual comprehension of speech. And you can see in a lot of places here, here especially, and here, you can see areas near Wernicke's area, or Wernicke's area itself is being activated, and that's because whenever you're trying to digest some information and comprehend it, you're using this part of the brain. And so, like this, there are like many areas of the brain that are specialized. These are just two sort of historically significant areas. People found these out pretty early. And so now we're going to be talking about the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortices of the brain. So I briefly talked about the somatosensory cortex. This is located in the parietal lobe of the brain, and the motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe of the brain. So this is a diagram of the frontal lobe, sort of put in a different perspective, and this is the same. This is that same thing, except it's this somatosensory cortex. And so basically, what this represents is the amount of space allocated towards controlling or sensing signals from this part of the body. Right? Here it's controlling because it's the motor cortex, and here it is receiving signals because it is the somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for putting together, getting the processing signals for the sense of touch from all of these different body parts. And so you see that there's a disproportionate sort of spread of space here. There's a lot of space allocated towards the face and the hands for both of these areas, and there's not a lot of space allocated towards sensing or controlling the lower parts of your body, like your feet. And so this is actually sort of indicative of evolutionary sort of pressures. It's very important that humans communicate with each other, and a large part of communication is through your face, how you express your emotions, and how you're able to convey many, like your mood, and your current state of mind, just by your face. Your face is a very important part of how you communicate, and so it's very important that you're able to control your face very well. Same thing with your hands. Humans are very dexterous. Hands are a multi-purpose tool that can be used for a very large number of activities, and a large part of that is because of the enormous amount of space dedicated towards controlling the hand in the motor cortex. Next, we're going to be talking about lateralization of the brain. So you may already know that the brain is designated into two different hemispheres, the left and the right. And so there's actually some tasks that are better suited for the left hemisphere and some that are better suited for the right. Like, they take care of different things. And so the left side of the brain is usually better, in most people, it's better at processing like language, like Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They're mostly dominant in the left side. They're also the left side is also responsible for logical reasoning and math aptitude. The right side of the brain is responsible for recognition of faces and patterns, and also nonverbal thinking. So, like, being able to visualize different things in your head without actually thinking in words. So this is kind of moving away from the cerebral cortex, and we're getting into different parts of the brain. The thalamus is actually kind of underneath the cortex, and it's basically the routing center of the brain. It gets a bunch of signals from all over the body, and it sends these signals to the appropriate lobes that are supposed to process it, right? Um, and not only does it send these signals to the different lobes, but it's a two-way communication. So it actually receives information from those lobes as well. So it can sort of intelligently designate what information goes based on all of the signals that it receives. The thalamus is also responsible for controlling your levels of arousal, which basically means like how awake you are. And the more information flowing from your thalamus into different areas of your brain, the more awake you are. This is actually a super interesting part of the brain, the hippocampus. It's also underneath the sort of cortical layer, the cortical areas that we talked about earlier. Um, we actually have two hippocampi, one on the left side and one on the right side. And the main role of this, actually, there's two main roles. One is to consolidate short term memory into long term memory. This is like essential for learning of any sort, and also very useful for spatial memory. So being able to like navigate over certain areas and know where certain things are. This is in large part due to the hippocampus. And I just want to talk about an interesting experiment that was done to about the hippocampus. Basically, a group of researchers um, scan the brains of taxi drivers in London. And so in London, they have something called black taxi cabs. And in order to be a driver for a black taxi cab, there's a rigorous set of examinations that you have to take. And basically, the rule is that a driver of a black taxi cab should be able to navigate and go to any address in London without having to use any sort of aid like a map or a GPS or any sort of assistance. And so you basically have to train for like several years in order to get that level of knowledge of the different areas of London. And it's actually like a test known as the Knowledge of London that has been in place since 1865. It's like a kind of honor in the world of taxi cab drivers, and it's like a pretty difficult examination to pass. Um, and so these researchers from the University of College of London, which is actually like very well known for their neuroscience programs, um, they went and scanned the brains of many different taxi cab drivers, and they found that the taxi cab drivers who had practiced for this exam and passed and had been driving on the streets for several years actually had a larger hippocampus compared to the normal person. And so this kind of shows the key role that hippocampus plays in navigation. Um, this is also, the limbic system is also something that's underneath the cortical layers of your brain. Um, includes several parts that we already talked about: the thalamus, the hippocampus, and also the amygdala. And so basically, it's named the limbus because it borders the brainstem, which, if you remember, is from previous slide, it's about here. So the limbus means bordering in Latin. And so this is basically the emotional center of your brain. It This part of the brain is responsible for bringing about a lot of emotions, and it interacts with other parts of the brain, like the cerebrum, um, to manifest emotions, right? So this will basically tell the cerebrum, hey, it's time to cry, hey, it's time to laugh. Um, and the cerebrum, which is responsible for actually carrying out those tasks, will do it. This is connected to that area of the brain. And it's also involved in storage of emotional memories. So, if you see a lion, um, your gut reaction is fear. And then that causes the fight or flight response, release of epinephrine, and so it's kind of like evolutionary advantageous if those sort of memories come to you automatically and very quickly, compared to other memories, because there are certain things where you just have to like get up and run, because of fear, so that you can survive and propagate into the future generations, right? So basically, emotional memory is like autonomic memories that come automatically and induce a sort of state in you that uh, that causes like a reaction for survival. Um, and so this part of the brain is actually responsible for creating and storing those memories differently. We don't still know like exactly how, but they get stored differently compared to like other memories, like if you're remembering certain facts, or navigational skills or whatever. And so now we're going to be talking about neuroplasticity. You've probably heard of the term neuroplasticity before. If you've heard of things like the growth mindset, um, you can remember what neuroplasticity is just by thinking of the sort of easy to remember message: neurons that fire together wire together. And so basically, neurons that um, have high activity between one another, um, the connections between them usually get strengthened over time after significant usage. And so there are two main ways that this can happen. The first way, outlined in figure A on the slide, is by the addition of new axon terminals from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. So this is sort of, if you want an analogy, sort of adding more ramps on a highway so that more cars can pass through, right? This Another way that the connection between two neurons can be strengthened is by actually altering the individual strengths of certain synapses, certain axon terminals, and the synapses. And so, that's basically like widening different highways, going back to the same analogy, so that more cars can pass through, right? These are two ways that the brain can sort of remodel itself in response to different cues, and it's a large part of how learning occurs in the brain. An interesting fact is about autism. Many researchers have been working on autism, and they think that um, it may actually be caused by the inability to remodel synapses, especially when you're a young child. And so, if this happens, unfortunately, um, kids who have autism aren't able to sort of learn as well as their peers. And so that may be a big reason as to sort of the behavioral effects that come with autism. This is sort of related to the neuroplasticity thing, but basically drugs of all kinds that are addictive, they interact with something known as a dopamine system. Dopamine is a chemical in the brain that stimulates the reward pathways, right? And so, having dopamine released in your brain makes you feel better. And so most drugs affect this area known as the ventral tegmental area, and this is the area that actually secretes dopamine to other parts of the brain. Various drugs do these in various ways. So for example, like nicotine stimulates the dopamine releasing neuron, whereas opium decreases the activity of an inhibitory neuron. And so these drugs, due to their structures, they all interact with the neurons in different ways, but the end result is that there's more dopamine sent to the reward system, and so that makes you crave it even more. And so understanding, different parts of the brain, like we've discussed, helps researchers um, better deal with addiction and find ways to help people who are addicted. And lastly, this is sort of unrelated to what we've been talking about, sort of like brain structure. Um, but Alzheimer's, basically, we're going to be discussing a lot of sort of neurodegenerative diseases in the future of the club, like towards the end of the year. And this is one of them. And so I thought, just like a preview would be nice, because we talked about some of the different parts of the brain that get affected by this disease. If you don't already know, Alzheimer's is basically a disease that mostly affects older people, and it leads to dementia, which is basically increased levels of confusion, and memory loss. And so, unfortunately, people who are affected by dementia often have a hard time remembering, where they live, who their family members are, and it's pretty devastating. And so, this disease actually causes the death of neurons in areas of the brain, like the hippocampus, and different parts of the cerebral cortex, and other parts as well. And this actually leads to a significant change in behavior. Researchers have identified two characteristic features. Basically, there's something called beta amyloid, which is a specific part of a cell membrane protein that gets cleaved off, and after these peptides get cleaved off, they form plaques around neurons, and that actually causes neuron death. Another characteristic of Alzheimer's is the tangles of tau proteins. Tau proteins are used to create microtubules that transport materials around the cells. And so these tau proteins actually start binding to themselves. And then once they bind to themselves, they get tangled up. And they're also situated around the neurons. And so these two characteristics, for some reason, lead to death of neurons, and open like enlarged ventricles, and basically um, cell death in the brain, and this is not good. And so we'll be discussing things like how to do, like, methods of early diagnosis of things like Alzheimer's, um, and other neurodegenerative diseases in the future. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for your time. Just a quick like bibliography, or references. All unsighted images were from the Campo Biology textbook or from Wikipedia. Um, um, and yeah, thank you for watching.